So, week 4. Welcome to another edition of PIT 502, Co-Designing the Future. I'm coming to you from Surf Beach in Kiama, and the tide's coming in, so the waves are a little bit loud. Forgive me for that. But I wanted to talk to you this week about values, very much aligned with design. And I've promised you for some time now that, we began with the build stage and knowing our stakeholders. We looked at alignment and interviewing them. We looked at discovery, basically extracting out those important issues. And today we're looking at design. And there's a lot of different ways to design. Design thinking is not new. We now have design schools that are linked to engineering schools to get people thinking outside the box and to innovate appropriately. But in this degree, we're thinking responsible innovation, but we're also thinking engineering by design. Public interest technologies require going beyond even responsible innovation and looking at various ways to meet the needs of constituents and clients and individuals and communities. It's all about community building, and different communities require different kinds of design approaches. Organizations like IDEO or Interaction Design have really led the way in some of those common ways that we could consider design. And the underlying principle of all of these approaches is to be user-centered or human-centered or person-centered. These are the terms that we often see interchangeably used, but they're all slightly different in nuance. But when people talk about privacy by design or value-sensitive design or ethical alignment by design, what do they really mean? And so we need to initially understand who are our stakeholders. We have to know who they are. We've got to know what they stand for. We've got to know where they're coming from. We've got to work together with them, not just for them. It's with them. And you can only work with someone when you spend enough time with them, observing them from afar, even looking at analytics on a web engine, even observing in the field will only give you a certain amount of knowledge. But when you break bread with someone, you go over and visit them in situ, in their homes, in their communities, on their reservations, on their tribal lands, in their facilities, then you really get to know more. But you can only know your user if you're with the user, if you connect with them in some deep way. And many of the PIT students have already talked about these important values. Over and over again, I hear people like Paul talking about connection. And Toby, you also mentioned this word. Paul, you've mentioned sensitivity before, and even internationalization to an extent. Time, I keep telling you, is a recurring theme in everything to do with public interest technology. And yesterday I saw this wonderful New America clip art which talked about the slow lane and the fast lane. And values are not about getting things out there yesterday. It's not about getting funders excited about a new technology that's going to make someone multi-million dollars. The things that count in society are usually free. And I don't mean like free internet or a free email account or free internet access or free all-you-can-eat kinds of deals. I don't mean about those bundle deals, because they're not really free. The user is paying something for them. But I'm talking about community services that might address issues related to accessibility because of disability, or homelessness, when people don't have a place to call home, they don't have shelter, and they're very vulnerable, they're at risk. when people are drug dependent or alcohol dependent, when people are living in situations where there's domestic violence or child abuse, where people are discriminated against because of racism, where the environment is treated poorly and chemicals are spilled into river systems, where people don't think about the longer term. And so the slow lane means that you're taking things and deliberating and considering what the impacts are in the future, what a particular technology might do in causing a ripple effect down the stream. And the fast lane is really about pillaging. It's really about introducing new technology without thinking about its effects on society. Oh yeah, we'll make a lot of money out of this, let's launch it. There's an app for that kind of mentality. And it doesn't mean that rapid prototyping is bad or time to market is, when you're considering things, is bad. You have to think about time to market with public interest technologies just as much. But what we hope is that by slowing down this process, we may well treat the environment better, we might treat people better, there might be less waste, there might be more reuse. This throwaway mentality that we're all living in at the moment, and this mentality that believes we don't really have to care about workers in another country who are enabling these new technologies to proliferate in the world. What about them? What are their working conditions like? What are their wages like? What are their living conditions like? What are their family lives like? And so I want to stress this week values. Batya Friedman and her team have written extensively, including David Hendry and numerous others, about value-sensitive design. Sarah Spiekerman has also written extensively about various socio-technical design systems and engineering by design. John C. Havens and the crew in the P7000 series of standards have talked about ethically aligned design, and Cavoukian talks about privacy by design. Numerous people in Europe talk about engineering by design. Well, what are your values and where do they come from? Shannon Vella has written a book on virtue ethics, which links to values. More precisely, virtues, but by extension to values. So if you identify your values, then people know what you're about. They know that perhaps, you know, how you've come to the conclusion of your approach to design. And while human-centered design or user-centered design always talks about having empathy, and its fundamental IDEO talk about empathy in reaching out to stakeholders. The other day I had a conference call with someone who was doing some interviews in the health domain, and she was over 10 minutes late, but I didn't know what she was doing. I didn't know she was busy, and I waited for her on Zoom. But she said, "Thanks, Kat, for waiting, because I was talking to a patient." And you just can't put down the phone, even though I was doing an interview that was supposed to finish at the half-hour mark. So I had to listen on, and I said, "You did the right thing." We've always got these time constraints. There's always congestion constraints and coverage constraints, and sometimes one of these two are the most powerful. How many people do you cover against your capacity and the congestion that comes with that? You know, some doctors and mental health professionals in the UK, I was hearing at a Law and Society conference in 2015, are having incredible trouble seeing mental health patients long enough. You know, 10-minute consultations, as if that's going to heal someone who's living with mental health issues. And so many of them felt under pressure to just hand over prescriptions that perhaps were not in the best interest of the individual seeking support and help. So what are your values? This week I'm going to introduce to you a couple of videos of my parents One, to show you the impacts of automation, the impacts of migration, the impacts of poverty at one stage that they came from, the impacts of war. But where did their values come from? Their parents were uneducated. And the question is whether communities require deep levels of education to have a particular value set, or how culture intervenes in value sets, what's important to different people, how they live their life, how they have what their expectations are of life. And so you'll hear recurring themes about care. And I want you to look up the ethics of care and care ethics. What does that mean? I care for you. What does I care for you mean? How can we have as a pillar in our design thinking care? And care in what? Care in our human subjects, care in the way we build something, care in our design specs, care in how nice our PowerPoints are, care in how much we respect each other in class, care in how we fill out an internal review board application form, care in how much we want the community to prosper and be empowered, care in the education and raising of awareness and knowledge development of a people, care of oneself. That's probably the hardest part sometimes, while you're caring for others, not to neglect yourself and to be able to accept help. And when someone says, I care for you, what does that mean? How do you respond? But care is just one aspect. What about respect? I respect you. What's your response to that? I respect you too? Prove it, show it. About a week ago, we had a discussion about the need to be as we are with one another on film or in a community setting where people are watching us, to be the same way at home when no one's watching. For now, at least. You know, the Alexas may be listening, but no one's watching. Not yet, anyway. The Samsung TV that's internet enabled may well be watching, but let's just say nobody's watching, and we think nobody's watching. So when our defenses are down, do we have respect? Do we have care? Do we have love? Do we have compassion? Do we have empathy? And to listen. In the first instance, I said we have to listen in order to understand who our stakeholders are. Read. In the second instance, we asked about alignment. Who are you going to interview and why? In the discovery stage, I asked you to listen. Listen to the transcripts, listen to the videos. Listen. And then in the design stage, we are still listening. Design is not just I go about my business, I create a spec and high-level design and put it out there and off we go, we implement. Design is iterative. It's continuous. It's this notion that there is no final solution. It's not just the optimal solution. We talk about that in socio-technical theory too. What optimal? Optimals change because people change and communities move. And people are hurt by different things. They have different life events. Communities have different life events. Communities may grow and develop and become more national, and other communities may shrivel and break down because of a variety of issues. So care and listening and love and respect. What about responsibility? Is that an underlying value? You researched these principles in Principles of Public Interest Technology with Professor Eric Fisher, who's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Responsible Innovation. What were those principles, those four, that you identified as being the most important? How are you going to embed them in the design process? What kinds of design tools and methods and maps are you going to use to interrogate your problem identification from the previous week? How are you going to inspect the pain chain chart? How are you going to keep check with your value proposition? And so I want you to think about this. And I also want you to think about where your values have come from. You can't give someone a list of values and ask them to robotically put them into practice. You have to live values. And when your values begin to clash with your ideals, you may have to question what your values are. Or when your workplace comes into contradiction with what your values are. Again, a big ask, but you may have to compromise where you work. Or become so powerful that you positively impact the space around you at work and instill those values that are important to you and your team. But friends, values are everything. Some of us seek spiritual orientation in the adoption of values or virtues. Some of these stem from this, age-old 10 Commandments. Others stem from the two ideals of the New Testament: love your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then you're fulfilling all the Old Testament commandments in that way. Others may seek inspiration in Confucianism or Taoism or Buddhism. Others in Hinduism. Others in ethics, raw ethics, although I always argue ethics have got to come from somewhere, especially when we start to look at specifics like morals or morality, or morals, I should say, more appropriately. Where do our morals come from? What governs them? So if we've had a solid upbringing, we've probably been exposed to some very good examples. And that's why use cases are so strong, so relevant to us today. Positive examples reaffirm values in systems. But how many socio-technical systems were built with those values in mind? That's the question. So what I'm asking you to do is to fuse your design thinking with value-sensitive design. But it's not just at one layer, because you could be talking about values, and then you could be talking about specifications like privacy and security. Now, they are values-based, but they're specific to a particular action. How to keep a system more secure, and how to keep data and personal information private. So as you begin to embark on scenario mapping, on visual storyboarding, on concept mapping, on mind mapping, on any of those 50-odd design thinking approaches in terms of frameworks and templates, keep asking yourself, where do I sit in all of this? I have some prescribed readings for this week. There are quite a few. One by Nancy Thomas from 2014 on democracy by design, which is another value-based approach. Jeremy Pitt from Imperial College London has also talked about various forms of democracy by design, espousing other kinds of by design processes. In his case, particularly for environmental resources and the redistribution of energy, for example, among many other things, of course. He looks at well-being in his research, and all of this is tied. Our values in society are tied back to our well-being. If we think that work trumps everything else, then we're going to start suffering in different ways, and we've already seen that in our community. Christine Paraxlis calls that allostatic overload. It's just too much to cope with. And last week, Matthew Mitka, in his videos with me, basically said we have to be healthy in order to help others. If we're not, we can't help others. If we can't help ourselves. And so you see from this big picture view of democracy by design and collective awareness and the use of big data in appropriate ways, right down to the personal. And in the meso stage, the community level. All of this is a fine balancing act. Look forward to talking to you about values in class this week. Thanks, team.